Greetings. Welcome back to Sick Flick. I'm so excited to be back. I'm so happy to have you back here with me. If you have forgotten about this podcast, Sick Flick is a stream of consciousness podcast that talks about everything under the sun regarding film and television. I'm your host, August Dunson. I am so glad to be back and to start doing this podcast again. So yeah, if you've been wondering where we've been, we took a little hiatus. Essentially, school during COVID times is a lot harder than I think anybody expected it would be. And so I kind of had to dedicate my entire life to finishing up this last year of school. Thankfully, that is behind us. And I'm just ready to get on, and I'm ready to get on with this podcast. I'm ready to start doing it again. So, yeah, we've also made some improvements. Some things have changed if you're watching on YouTube, and things will continue to change, but if you stick beside us, it will all pay off in the end, I can promise you. So yeah, I'm ready to get started with this episode. Without further ado, we ended off still doing our Pride series. And even though I have abandoned this podcast for a couple of months, I still want to finish out this Pride series with the last episode. So, if you don't remember, I started a Pride series a while ago where essentially the past 6 episodes, I think, we talked about different queer films and the importance of them all, the conversations they started, a lot of, extra things regarding those movies. If you haven't seen that series, I definitely recommend watching it. It was a hell of a lot of fun to do, and I'm ready to finish it out with a bang with our queer episode. So yes, I went through all of the major communities within the LGBTQ plus community, and our last one we're ending with queer films. So we'll be talking about different queer films and their importance, why I enjoyed them, the whole shebang. Also, for the regular scheduling of the podcast, or the regular setup of the podcast, I like to do a what's happening in the entertainment world segment at the beginning. Granted, for our Pride series, I changed that up to be our queer cinema facts. And for this queer episode, it's not going to follow the exact same setup as the other episodes, just because this is kind of the melting pot of queer cinema. So first I want to go over the GLAAD Report. That is kind of the big report that comes out yearly for queer representation. We're going to be focusing on the 2019 film, so the 2020 report, just because the 2021 report focused mostly on television shows, just because there weren't a lot of films that came out of the 2020 period. So I decided to focus on the 2019 just so that we could talk a little bit more about films. And then we're going to move on to discussing new queer cinema, because I think that is a very important aspect of queer film history that we haven't talked about yet. So moving on to the GLAAD reports. So for the first one, out of 118 films counted in 2019, the overall number of queer characters represented on screen was about 18%, or 22 films out of the 118. That was actually an increase from 2018. Did I say 2019 or 2018? I don't remember. But the 2019 report, or the 2019 films, was an increase from films that they reported in 2018 by just about 2 films. So I guess in 2018 they only had 20 films out of how many they recorded or researched. And this past report, they had 22 films. It was a decrease, though, in lesbian and bisexual representation, and then as well as racial diversity. So it says that in the report that the racial diversity actually decreased 34% in 2019 from 42% in 2018, and then that was also decreased from 57% in 2017, which is interesting to note just how you can see a steady decline in racial diversity or the representation of like queer characters of color, which I feel like I definitely have been seeing more of. You definitely notice just overall in media, especially with like the boom. I don't want to say boom, but you think back of like the 90s or early 2000s, and then you look at a lot of films today and you're like, how has our characters of color or just, representation, you've kind of seen that gone down in recent years. So that's really interesting to note, especially as it pertains to queer characters. And then there was only one queer and disabled character. But it was the first time that they also counted one in general, which I think is that one show of, I forget what like disability he necessarily has, but I think it's the show on Netflix. I forget what it's called as well. But that might have been the one that they had counted, which it's kind of a bittersweet report how it's only one, but also the fact that it is one, but also the fact that it's the only one that they've seen. So you can take that as you will. Also, they reported that 0 trans characters were found amongst the 118 films counted, but that has been constantly found in the past 2 reports. Like I said, this report focuses on films. I think most of the GLAAD reports focus on films. So if you're wondering, like Pose, for example, I can see how it's not considered in this just because that is technically a TV show. I would be interested to see the report for 2021 to check and see like how that has changed regarding television shows. But yeah, I guess with films, there have not been any trans characters found in the films that they reported, which is also interesting to note because, like I said, it's not all the films. It's only 118, but still, nonetheless. And I guess, it's also kind of sad to know that that is consistent. It's not really an outlier in any way. And then lastly, GLAAD found 2 inclusive animated/family films. Previously, it was 0. So it's kind of fluctuating of, good and bad. So they did find, like I said, 2 films that include queer or more inclusive characters within like animated or family films. So that could show something in how society is moving towards more inclusive stories for kids. I know at this particular time there's been I know that there's a bunch of shorts that are more inclusive or represent queer characters. I don't know if it's 100% true, but what that Luca film that came out, I think that also is a more inclusive, or it is a story that includes queer characters or is centered around queer characters. So that would be interesting to know again for this year, but we're not going to see a report on this year anytime soon. So yeah, so those are kind of the main points that I have for the 2020 report from the 2019 film. So this is a whole year late of films, or of a report, but I wanted to focus more on films, and I think that it's still important to see nonetheless, especially if you do your own research and look at how the report from 2020 holds up with this, be it in films or also in television shows. And then lastly, I want to move on to new queer cinema. So like I said, this is a bit different of an episode regarding structure. New queer cinema is more of the like film history facts part, but I want to talk about this particular movement within cinema and within queer history because I think it is fundamental in knowing about film and queer film history. But I think also what comes out of this shows a lot for the films that we've talked about in this series, the films I'm going to be talking about today, but also the films that these films kind of influence going forward. So, if you don't know, the new queer cinema is the more of the academic term that defines the cinematic movement of like the 90s. So, it was mostly queer themed independent filmmaking of the early 90s. It was coined by B. Ruby Rich in the Sight and Sound magazine in 1992. And like I said, this mostly categorizes independent filmmakers that focus their stories on queer people and queer characters. And it was kind of most prevalent in the early 90s. Films during this time usually shared themes such as the rejection of heteronormativity and the lives of LGBTQ plus characters or protagonists that also usually lived on the fringes of society. And so the identification for queer cinema emerged around the mid-90s through the influence of queer theory as well. That became more prevalent during that time as well. And it was mostly in response to the AIDS crisis. So if you have not been following along with this podcast, I spoke about the AIDS crisis and what that did and looked like for queer cinema during that time and moving forward in our gay episode. If you want to know more about the AIDS crisis relating to cinema history, I would definitely go check out that episode because I go more in depth about it, both the actual event, but also what that meant for filmmakers and how that looked on screen again during that time and going forward. So it was kind of seen as a response to that crisis, and it was very much associated with like avant-garde or underground films. Like I said, it's more heavily related towards the independent filmmakers. So yeah, and some of the early queer cinema trailblazers for like lesbian avant-garde filmmakers, there is, I am probably going to butcher these names, Ulrich Ottinger, possibly, Chantal Ackman, and Pratibha Parmar. I hope I'm saying those somewhat correctly. I will probably include them in the Instagram post so you can actually look them up if I did butcher their names. But those are some of the trailblazers, I guess, especially for lesbian avant-garde. There's also Rainer Werner Fassbinder. His films from the 1970s and 80s. European art films. So those films in particular, yes, they are before the 90s, but I think that they, you know, again, trailblazers, they were kind of the influencers of that time that led to, you know, this big boom. And they added a more queer sensibility to film in general. So it might not have been particularly about specifically queer characters or queer stories, but I think in their films they add this queer lens or queer film, queer sensibility to film. And then the film The Kiss of the Spider Woman that came out in 1985 by Hector Babenko. Anyways, that film, it examined the relationship between sexual, social, and political oppression. So that's also big during that time, and those are some of the main themes that you see going forward in the new queer cinema movement. So, like I said, sexual, social, and political oppression, those come up in the new queer cinema movement. And that's kind of where that got its start in that film, if that makes sense. And then lastly, some of the notable films from the movement, The Watermelon Woman, Paris is Burning, and My Private Idaho. I think I've spoken about all of them. I might not have spoken about My Private Idaho, but I know I spoke about the other two. So if you want to know more about those and why they're so notable, those are both included. Actually, no, they're not. The Watermelon Woman is included in my lesbian episode. Paris is Burning, I think that is included in the trans episode. So if you want to learn about those films in particular, they're going to be in those two episodes. And if I didn't speak about My Private Idaho, which would be in our gay episode, then that is another notable film to watch or to check out. And then lastly of all, the 1990s ushered in the new queer cinema movement. And it kind of faded out as queerness became more acceptable. So probably towards the late 90s or early 2000s especially, that's kind of when you started to see that decrease in films. So yeah, that is just a really very, very, very brief overview of the new queer cinema movement. If that is particularly interesting to you, definitely check out or go, check out some films that came out during that time. I know that I've discussed some films from that era, like I said, The Watermelon Woman, Paris is Burning, My Private Idaho, and I have some other films that we're going to be talking about today that came out of that period. And, the more research you do, you can actually find more about it. And I think that's a very important time in film history. It's also very important to note regarding queer history and especially queer cinema history. So yes, with all that being said, let's conclude to the rest of the episode. So I have a couple of films that I want to discuss. I know I say this all the time, but I actually want to keep this episode pretty short, just in our final conclusion of this entire series at large. So these are kind of some of the films that I just did not get around to talking about that I think are particularly interesting, or some films that I have found in this little hiatus that I've been on that I also want to discuss. Like I said, this is just a general queer episode, so it's not really focused on anything. It's just kind of a last hurrah. So the first one that I want to talk about, which also coincides with the new queer cinema movement, is the film Tongues Untied. Now, Tongues Untied came out in 1989. Yes, it is a bit early for the strict timeline of the new queer cinema movement, but as with everything in history, nothing is that, concrete. So I would still consider it part of the new queer cinema movement. It might be just, again, one of the trailblazers that came out during that time. It is an experimental documentary film by Marlon T. Riggs, and it is kind of a poetic way of, I would say, exploring queerness or Black gay sexuality, while also coping with the oppressions that Black gay men faced during that time. I think that it does a really good job of using poetry, abstraction, and just non-conventional forms of filmmaking to explore different themes, different communities and conversations within the overarching queer community, but also within Black gay spaces. I watched it a while ago, so I'm not that well in tune with it, but I know that there were definitely a lot of parts that stuck out to me. And I think the main thing that I want to talk about that film is the like poetic aspect of it, or the poetry of it. There are some parts where they do speak, if it's not a literal poem, they speak very poetically. And it's just the way that the film is conducted. It's not your conventional documentary film. It's not something that is just like an observer watching people go about their lives, or, you know, it's not even unnecessarily a film where people sit down and talk about things. If you haven't seen the film, like I said, it's very experimental, and it very much deals with abstraction. And if you have seen it, I think you would definitely agree that it's just non-conventional in the sense that you would think of a documentary today, or you would think of a documentary at all. But I think that abstraction, it reminds me of the idea of like queering cinema or queering any sort of media, in the way that like your approach, your method, or your outcome is non-conventional. It doesn't follow it doesn't adhere to a strict structure or any sort of binary or expectation of what the form or the medium should be. And I think that that's definitely true with this film. And I think in a sense, because that is what this film does, it only further adheres to the idea of it being such a important queer film, but also in the way that it explores, like I said, being queer, being a gay black man in the 80s or early 90s. And I think that form of filmmaking is very important because, again, obviously you can tell important stories through conventional means, but I think what is such an important aspect, or I don't know, like queerness in and of itself is not like non-conventional in a bad sense, but like it, and not even like not the norm. Like I'm saying, it doesn't have any of the negative connotations where, you know, it is bad, it is the other, but it is the other, you know? And so I think this film, it uses that idea of the other beautifully because it explores queerness in a way that, again, rejects heteronormativity. It rejects the strict confines of structure. It rejects a lot of the binaries of like conventional documentary film form, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm sounding pretentious when I'm saying it, but I think that what I'm saying makes sense. And again, I think that the way that Marlon Riggs does it so beautifully is also through the mending of poetry. So like I think that like the way he uses poetry and performance art, it also makes it like a beautiful exploration of queerness. But like I said, it does it in a way that fits the mode of the new queer cinema movement, in that it kind of rejects the form. It kind of rejects heteronormativity by using abstraction or using experimental ways of documentary making to explore those ideas, if that all makes sense. So yeah, I really like that movie. I watched it on the Criterion channel because they had a bunch of his films and work on there. I'm not sure if it's still on there today. Hopefully it is, because that actually had been on my watch list for a couple of years and I wasn't able to find it anywhere. And then when I saw that they were having it at the Criterion channel, I had to jump on it and watch it. So if it's still there, I highly recommend it. I wish I could remember more of it to give you a really good analysis of it. But I think that it's still very important, very fundamental to the reading list of queer cinema films. And I think that it is an important milestone both in the queer cinema movement but also in queer film history in general. So I definitely think that it is a movie that you should definitely watch, especially if you're particularly interested in queer films as well. So moving on, we're actually going to be talking about a short film. And I don't know if I've talked about short films before. I know in our trans episode was probably the first that I actually talked about TV shows, but I don't know if I've talked about a short film. And I also watched this on the Criterion channel. I think it is still on there. And it is also a newer film. I think it came out in like 2018, possibly. But it's called Pillars. And I really enjoyed Pillars because, one, it is one of our films that discusses or looks at the queer youth. I always want to make sure to include stories that talk about queer youth because I think that that is also important. But it also explores queerness as at like the childhood age. In a particularly interesting way, because I think with like Tomboy really, it did a good job of showcasing, I don't know how to describe it, like showcasing a child grapple with their identity. And I think in some way you obviously like you explore, you start to question identity, and what gender expression and what your gender identity is from the perspective of a child, which I think kind of helps you humanize queer children, as well as maybe give people a better understanding of what that exploration process or time period looks like for a lot of queer children. But I think with Pillars particularly, I like how it explores less of the gender identity part and more of the actual sexuality. And that's where you really start to see early developments of sexuality just in general, but also for queer children. And I mean that as in like, I don't know, like I think a big part of exploring one's sexuality is like your first kiss, you know? And so for a lot of people, it usually happens around like elementary, middle school-ish, and that's kind of when people start to, that's when people start to think about like their first crush. Oh, I remember my first crush. It was in like the second grade or whatever. Or being like, oh, my first boyfriend was in the fifth grade or whatever. Like I think those moments, especially in elementary and middle school, those are when you start to experience your first when it comes to recognizing yourself as like a sexual being. Not necessarily particularly in regards to like sex, but literally just in attraction and your sexuality, how you look at people and the kind of people that you're interested in. And I think with Pillars in particularly, it explores that early developmental stage really nicely, especially regarding like queer identities. So it's like about a little girl. She mostly it kind of all centers in church, or heavily associated with church. And I think I watched all of these films a while ago. But I think she befriends this other girl in like her little like church group. And they share a kiss. I don't know like who started. I don't really know the context of that kiss, but I think through that you see her, like you see her start to realize like that she's kind of queer in some sense. Like not that explicitly, but you just kind of see her come into her identity more through that experience. And I think ultimately I think they, like, her parents find out or somebody finds out. She's shunned in some way. I forget the rest. This episode has been such, like, the context of this episode was, like, I came up with the context of this episode such a long time ago. I just had not had the time to film and, like, edit an episode properly. So it's like my memory of these is not the best. And I couldn't necessarily watch all of these films, but from what I remember from my notes, this is what happened. I don't remember the actual, like, events, like the explicit events of every thing that I watched, of every film that I watched, but I can remember a lot of the key points, and a lot of reasons why I still think they are very important to discuss, if that makes sense. You know what I'm saying? So yes. So, like I said, that one, I think that it's different from some of the other films that we discussed regarding queer youth, because a lot of them, one, are centered on queer teenagers or young adults. Like I said, Tomboy, I think, is the only one that really focuses on a young child. And Pillars is the same way. Like, these are, if not elementary school, they are early middle school. Like, these are not more than, like, the children are no more than like 10 or 11 years old, like absolute max. So I think it's important because of how it explores queerness at that age, but also different from Tomboy in the fact that it's not necessarily focused on exploring or understanding gender identity as a child, and more so explicitly just sexuality as a child. And also, I think that it's interesting that it explores that in, like, the Deep South or in Southern religious settings. Because, like I said, Pariah, it was set in, it wasn't necessarily the Deep South, but it was set in, like, a religious setting. Her parents were very religious, and she was kind of forced into that lifestyle in some degree. What else? Alex Strangelove, I don't think that was religious at all. So I think Pariah is really the only other one that's religious. But like I said, that one is for a teenager. So it doesn't necessarily, like, it does explore the early... Actually, no, it doesn't. Because Pariah already knows that she's gay. So yeah, Pariah... The only thing that Pariah and Pillars share is the religious aspect, but Pariah is also 18, and she also already knows her sexuality going into the film. With this film, you see the young girl explore and understand it as the film progresses, all while being in the setting of either the Deep South or in the church or in religious setting. And so I think that, again, it's another way that you see how the environment of, like, the church or just very heavily religious settings, people, influences, has an impact on the queer youth, but also you see an aspect of a young queer child grappling with their sexuality or exploring their sexuality while being in the confines of the church setting. And I say confines not in any particularly bad way, but you literally see it as it unfolds in the film that is kind of a confine in of itself. So yeah, and I think it's a really good film. Like I said, it's a short film. I think I saw it on the Criterion channel. I think that it should still be on there, but if not, I don't know. Maybe you can find it on YouTube or something. And yeah, it's one of the earlier films, and I think it was directed by a young Black woman. Okay, so yeah, it came out in 2019, and it is directed by Haley Elizabeth Anderson. And yeah, it should still be on the Criterion channel. So definitely go watch that. I think it's really good. And like I said, it's different from the other ones in the fact that it explores sexuality as a young child, and also while being in the Deep South or the church setting. So yeah, moving on, I want to talk about the film Mysterious Skin. That also came out during the new queer cinema movement. The director, actually, Greg Araki, he is a big face of that movement. A lot of his films deal with queer characters living on the fringes, quite literally. And Mysterious Skin is not an exception to that. Mysterious Skin was actually a very groundbreaking film for me to watch. I think that it really impacted me in the way that it's a deeply emotional film and it's a deeply unsettling film, in the way that you literally watch it, if that makes sense. So Mysterious Skin is actually about these two boys who were groomed, raped, and molested as young children by their baseball coach. So one of the guys, he was the first victim, and I think it was something where his mom wasn't there to pick him up at a baseball game, and so his coach picked him up, and his coach took him home to like his house, and that's where he kind of started grooming him into having sexual relations with him. So it became a thing where he befriended the little boy, and they would like hang out a lot. Like he befriended the mom to get him to hang out with him, and every time they would hang out, he would coerce him into some sort of sexual act. And then later, I don't want to say he convinced, but I guess like in the whole brainwashing of that little boy, the two of them convinced this other little boy to like hang out with them, where then he made them perform sexual acts, both on each other or on him. And it's very uncomfortable to watch, especially with the way that it is filmed. But the way that it is filmed is also very great because like Greg Araki himself made sure that he protected the child actors. I think in an interview, which I think was also on the Criterion channel. I also watched it on the Criterion channel. But I think in the interview about this film, he said that it was kind of tricky to maneuver through the film because for the kids, he made them believe that he like gave them a completely different script. So they had no idea what they were necessarily not performing, but like for them, they were making a separate movie. And he made sure to not put them in any compromising roles or anything with the adult actors that would kind of give it away for the kids. So in a sense, you know, he really protected their innocence, not only in the film, like in the world of the film, but also in the filming process, which I think is very good. And it speaks to the ethics of this film, but also to, you know, the meaning or sentimental value it has. But also I think of like compared to like Blue is the Warmest Color, where that film is very unethical in the way that it was shot and produced because of how the director treated or handled its actors. I think, again, it's necessarily good that that film went about it in that way because, especially when you're watching the film, I had to ask that question. Like, how, like, I'm watching the film and I'm like, how is this legal? You know? So I'm glad that that's mentioned because I think any person that sees beyond the film, or it just feels so deeply by the film, you start to ask those questions of like, how was this film made? And so I'm really glad to hear that he made sure to keep the innocence of the actors intact in creating that film. But with the movie itself, a big thing that stuck out to me was particularly how trauma affects you differently. Like I said, the two main characters are two boys that were groomed and molested by this older man. And you see how their two lives diverge from that main event. The first boy that was brought along, he's played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, if that helps, if you're watching the movie or if you see any shots about it. So he's played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and he takes the more hypersexual route of coping with trauma. I think when you talk about like sexual trauma, there's usually two main routes that people fall into when they're in when they are coping with that sexual trauma. A lot of people turn towards hypersexuality, and a lot of people turn towards like asexuality. So for Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character, he turns towards hypersexuality and ends up becoming a like male prostitute. And so he's kind of known in his like hometown for sleeping with a lot of older men. And then he later moves to New York, where he kind of continues that for a little bit before another dramatic event happens. And then for the second boy that was brought along, he kind of turns completely inward, and becomes he does become asexual, but I guess where the film kind of delves off into a more interesting note is like he actually blacks out or like blocks out a lot of those traumatic moments. So he doesn't know what happens to him. He doesn't know that at a young age at this time he was molested or raped. He just knows that there are points in times in his lives where he blacked out, where his memory is completely gone. And so he convinces himself that he has been abducted by aliens. And so in this film, he is kind of trying to figure out where these gaps are coming from, what happens in between these gaps. And, up until like the very end, he's kind of convinced that it's him having some sort of relationship with aliens. So he's trying to track down these aliens and all this stuff. It's kind of hard to follow at first because you don't really realize that he is one of the kids that was sexually assaulted. And so you kind of see Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character going on a whole thing, and then you switch to him and he's trying to find these aliens. You're kind of like, I don't understand what's going on. But that's kind of his story. And so like I said, it's kind of interesting to note how trauma affects people differently, and I really enjoy that this film explores that, because like I said, I think a lot of people see hypersexuality as the main result of sexual trauma, and I think in some way people like to demonize people that are very sexual, or they like to look down upon people that may be, very sexual, especially people that have experienced some sort of sexual trauma. And so I think, again, this film shows how that coping mechanism comes forward, I guess, or how that coping mechanism comes out through sexual trauma, but it also kind of shows the counterpart to that, which is kind of retreating from sex or sexuality in general. And I think that it handles both of those situations very well. It humanizes both of them. And I think in the end, you really start to understand the two characters more and how they came to these different conclusions. And then you kind of just see that at the end, the result is from the same thing, It just kind of breeds different end results for each character. And then, like I said, the last thing, I guess I talked about it all, because I talked about the new queer cinema movement, and then I talked about how it showcases sexual violence with kids while protecting the actor's innocence. I guess to speak about that just a little bit more, like I said, I think that this film does a really good job of protecting the child actors, both on screen, but in the production part of the film, which again, you see that in an interview. But in the film, like, I think a big thing that stood out to me is that there's not a lot of scenes where the child actors and the adult actors are together, especially when it's the scenes that involve like sexual violence. And I think that also like creates like an eeriness to the film in and of itself, because the moments where sexual violence is being enacted on them, seeing the kids' reactions is it's a bit how do I describe it? Like it's a bit separated from the act itself. Like, you don't really get to understand the act itself from the kids' performance, which I think is the purpose. And I think that is what really does the job of keeping their innocence intact. It's more of like the overall like essence or overall like energy of it. Like, the scenes have an erotic tone, they have an erotic feel to it, even if you don't see like explicit acts being portrayed. And like I said, I think that that's good in protecting the actors, but also in creating that uncomfortability in the film itself, which kind of just makes it harder to watch in a sense, but I think it also makes it very impactful. So that's kind of all I have to say on the matter. Moving on to, I want to briefly, not even really discuss, but briefly mention the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Because I think, again, in talking about queer films, there are some queer films that you just have to talk about. And I think the Rocky Horror Picture Show is one of those films. I only saw it once in full. I went to an actual like screening / performance of it, which I think is the best way to experience it firsthand, just because I think that overall environment is really great. I think that also says something about like queer media, and yeah, like, I don't know, the idea, it kind of relates to like drag, like this performative element of queerness, I'll say. And so I think like those films like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, I mean, it's not queer by any means, but like The Room, how they do the same thing with The Room, I think obviously the Rocky Horror Picture Show kind of originated that whole idea. But I think that like that element of itself of how you experience the Rocky Horror Picture Show is important to the film, but also to queer cinema, and queer media in general, because I think that that performance part of it is important to the experience of queerness, if that makes sense. But yeah, I just want to include the Rocky Horror Picture Show just because I think that that's important to include when talking about queer cinema. And then lastly, again, I just want to briefly talk about Jennifer's Body. More so in the fact that it's kind of one of the only like feminist horror films. And horror films that center around queer characters or queer protagonists that is not necessarily bad. I know that I forget which episode we talked about it, but we talked about like queer characters as kind of like villains, like horror film villains. Like a lot of it is like men dressing up as women to enact these horrible crimes upon people, or like what is it? Homicidal homosexual, like that trope that we talked about. And I think with this film, it doesn't feed into that trope, because, like, yes, it is like a queer character enacting these horrible violence, but I think, again, it takes a feminist perspective. It's much more in line with protecting women, if that makes sense. I'm not the most well versed on it. Also, I can't necessarily give you like the most like articulate exploration of it, but I think what makes Jennifer's Body stand out and not necessarily fall in the line of like horror film queer stereotypes is the fact that it takes a feminist approach to it, and the fact that the lens at which it views its like villain is in much better light than I think other horror films that include queer characters do. It's not one of the films that like demonizes its queer characters. It's a bit more coded. Like I think we've only kind of seen it as like a queer film as of late through other like explorations, and I think later on the director maybe came out and said something. So it's still very much like a coded film, but I think, again, in essence, the film doesn't, one, having its protagonist be queer coded or having its protagonist be a queer characters, I think definitely helps. Also, as I keep saying, the feminist turn to it, and the fact that the movie doesn't seek to demonize or beat down women or queer characters. I think that that's what really sets it apart from a lot of the queer stereotypes or codings of queer characters in like horror films that we've seen throughout history that have kind of necessarily plagued queer characters in a negative light, if that makes sense. So yeah, that's kind of all I wanted to talk about kind of briefly. In closing out this series, I just want to say thank you if you are still watching, if you follow along through this series. I know that we discussed a lot of heavy topics and just a lot of topics in general throughout the films and TV shows and short films that we discussed. So I think I discussed it in the beginning of this series in like the introductory episode, but you know, as we close out, I never want anything I say to come off as offensive. I'm very interested in queer culture, queer cinema, queer film history, and so everything that I watch, read, learn, discuss is from genuine interest and, I don't know, appreciation. So I don't think I know it all. I just discussed some of the things that I've seen in some of the movies and TV shows and films that I've watched. And all of this is also to open up dialogue. So if you have any thoughts that you want to talk about regarding any of the films that I talked about, I would love to hear it. I always want to, talk about films. This is why this podcast is here, is to discuss films and the different elements that I think they bring to the medium at large. But yeah, I've had so much fun talking about all of these queer films. Obviously, this is not the end all be all. I would love to revisit this series sometime in the future to discuss more, also to discuss some of these films with other people. And I'm so glad to be back. And I cannot wait for what is to come for this podcast. And I'm just so glad to be finishing up this series. So yeah, with all that being said, thank you for tuning in. Hopefully you finished the end of this episode. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. And I think that's all I have to say. So, peace out, Girl Scout.